My mom's siblings made her cook for 70 people and snapped their fingers for drink refills at their reunion, saying, "Some people are meant to be servers." So my mom Lucy came from a family of 6 kids, and she was the youngest. Her siblings all went to college while she stayed home to take care of their dad when he got sick. She worked at a grocery store during the day, and nursed him at night for 3 years until he passed. By then, her siblings all had their fancy careers. Her brother Thomas was a dentist, sister Janet ran a real estate office, brother Carl did something with investments, sister Dorothy married a guy who owned car dealerships, and brother Frank was a principal at some private school. Mom never made it to college, but she worked her way up to manage the whole grocery store and married my dad, who was a mechanic. They had me and my sister Rose, and we lived in this small ranch house that Mom kept perfect. Growing up, my mom's siblings would visit maybe once a year, and always had something to say about our house, Dad's job, Mom's weight, our clothes, everything. But Mom still loved them, and always talked about how successful they were. Every 5 years, they had a big family reunion at whoever could host the most people. This year, it was Dorothy's turn at her husband's lake house. Mom was so excited she bought a new dress, made her famous potato salad, and 2 pies from scratch. We drove 6 hours to get there. The second we arrived, Dorothy handed Mom an apron and said she'd need help setting up since the caterers had canceled. There were no caterers. Mom spent the first day cooking 40 pounds of barbecue, making sides for 70 people, and setting up tables while Dorothy sat by the pool with Janet, talking about their latest vacations. During dinner, Thomas actually snapped his fingers at Mom to refill his drink. My dad started to say something, but Mom squeezed his shoulder to let it go. Carl complained the meat was dry and told Mom she should have started cooking earlier. Frank's wife asked Mom to watch their 4 kids while the adults talked. The kids were teenagers. Day 2 was worse. Dorothy had Mom up at 5, making breakfast for everyone, then cleaning rooms because the house was so full, then prepping lunch, then starting dinner. Janet actually handed Mom her laundry and said, since she was doing towels anyway. When Mom finally sat down to eat, Carl asked her to get him more ice first. Then Thomas needed steak sauce. Then Dorothy's husband needed another beer. Mom never got to finish a meal. Rose finally snapped and asked why nobody else was helping. Dorothy laughed and said Mom didn't mind. She'd always been the helpful one in the family. Janet added that some people were meant to be servers and some were meant to be served. And wasn't it nice that Mom had found her calling at the grocery store? Mom's eyes just went dead. She smiled and kept serving. Dad wanted to leave, but Mom said family was important. We stayed all 4 days, and Mom basically worked as unpaid staff while her siblings treated her like the help. The drive home was silent. Mom didn't cry, just stared out the window. That's when I started planning. See, I'd just gotten promoted to regional manager at my company. I was 28 and making more than any of Mom's siblings knew. My husband Alex was a software engineer who'd just sold his app to some tech company for stupid money. We'd been living normally to avoid family drama, but now I didn't care. 6 months later, I announced I was hosting the next reunion early at our new house. Didn't tell them we'd bought a 7-bedroom place in the hills with a pool, tennis court, and guest house. Also, didn't tell them about the actual catering staff I'd hired. Mom's siblings showed up expecting another servant situation. Their faces when they saw our house were perfect. Dorothy whispered to Janet, asking if we were renting it for the weekend. I said no, we'd bought it cash. Thomas asked what Alex did again. I said he retired at 30 after selling his company. Then I handed out the itinerary I'd made. Pool time for the kids while adults helped with meal prep. A tennis tournament where losers did dish duty. Game night, where last place cleaned up. Dorothy laughed and said surely I'd hired help. I said Mom taught me that family helps each other, so we'd all pitch in. Dorothy's laugh came out too high, almost nervous, and she glanced at Janet before looking back at me. She said I was joking, right, about everyone helping with the work this weekend. I kept my face completely blank and told her the schedule starts tomorrow morning at 6 sharp. Thomas shifted in his seat and looked over at Carl with this uncomfortable expression, like they were both trying to figure out if I was serious. Janet cleared her throat and asked if there was maybe a service nearby they could hire instead, someone who could come help with the cooking and cleaning. I smiled and said no, we'd be doing everything ourselves as a family. Frank's wife opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, but then closed it again. I told them all to head to their assigned guest rooms and they'd find the full schedule posted on each door. Dorothy tried to laugh again, but it died in her throat when she saw I wasn't joining in. I walked each of them to their rooms personally, making sure they saw the printed schedules I'd laminated and hung on little hooks. The sheets listed every meal, every cleanup rotation, every single task for the entire weekend in neat columns. Frank's wife picked up her copy and read through it slowly, her eyebrows climbing higher with each line. She asked if this was some kind of social experiment for work or something. I smiled at her and said, Mom taught me that family takes care of each other, and I wanted to make sure we all practiced what she'd been preaching our whole lives. Janet stared at her schedule like it was written in another language. Thomas folded his arms and asked how long I'd been planning this, and I told him about 6 months, ever since their last reunion. Carl muttered something under his breath that I didn't quite catch, but definitely wasn't happy. Dorothy's husband looked at his wife with this expression that said he wanted to leave right now, but Dorothy just smiled tightly and said it would be fine. They could handle a little cooking. That first evening, I had the catering staff I'd hired serve an elaborate dinner in the formal dining room. They brought out course after course, this beautiful spread of food that must have cost a fortune, and my mom's siblings sat around the table looking confused. They kept glancing at each other, clearly wondering when I was going to ask them to start helping. I watched Dorothy whisper something to Janet, probably asking when the work was supposed to start. Mom sat next to me and kept shooting me these worried looks, her eyes asking if I knew what I was doing. I reached under the table and squeezed her hand, trying to tell her without words that everything was going to be okay. She squeezed back but didn't look convinced. The meal went on for almost 2 hours, with the staff clearing plates and refilling glasses and bringing out dessert, and I could see my uncles and aunts getting more and more confused about why they weren't being put to work yet. Thomas actually looked relieved, like maybe he'd misunderstood the whole schedule thing. I let them think that for now. After dinner, everyone started getting up from the table, probably thinking they could go relax by the pool or watch TV. I stood up and announced in a clear voice that tomorrow's breakfast crew was Thomas and Carl. They needed to have food ready for 20 people by 8 in the morning. Thomas stopped moving and stared at me, his mouth opening to protest. I cut him off before he could get a word out and said surely a successful dentist and investment manager could figure out how to make pancakes and eggs for the family. Carl's face went red and he started to say something about not knowing where anything was in my kitchen. I told him that was what the morning was for, figuring it out, just like Mom had to figure out how to cook for 70 people with no notice at their reunion. Janet laughed nervously and said they could just go out for breakfast. There must be nice restaurants nearby. I shook my head and reminded her that Mom never got to suggest going out when she was doing all the cooking. The room went quiet and uncomfortable. Mom looked down at her plate. Dad caught my eye and gave me this tiny nod, like he approved but was worried about where this was going. Alex squeezed my shoulder in support. The next morning at 5:45, I walked down the hallway to the guest wing and knocked loudly on Thomas's door. I called out cheerfully that he had 15 minutes before he needed to be in the kitchen starting breakfast. I heard a groan from inside and what sounded like him rolling over in bed. I knocked on Carl's door next. Same cheerful reminder about the 15-minute countdown. Through his door, I heard him complain about the early hour, asking what kind of person makes their family get up before 6 on vacation. I smiled to myself and headed down to the kitchen to set up. I made myself a big cup of coffee and pulled one of the kitchen chairs over to face the stove area. Then I sat down and waited. At 6 on the dot, Carl stumbled in wearing sweatpants and a wrinkled t-shirt, his hair sticking up on one side. He squinted at me and asked where the coffee was. I pointed at the industrial coffee maker on the counter and told him to figure it out. Thomas showed up 3 minutes later looking just as rough, and the two of them stood in my kitchen looking completely lost. I sipped my coffee and watched them stumble around, not helping at all. Carl opened random cabinets looking for pancake mix, while Thomas tried to figure out how to work the fancy coffee maker I'd specifically bought because it was complicated. He pressed buttons and nothing happened, then pressed more buttons and the machine started making angry beeping sounds. Carl finally found the pantry and pulled out flour and sugar and eggs, dumping them on the counter with no idea what to do next. I asked if they needed the recipe for pancakes, and Carl snapped that he knew how to make pancakes. Except clearly he didn't, because he mixed everything in the wrong order and the batter came out lumpy and weird. Thomas finally got the coffee maker working but made it way too strong and the smell filled the kitchen like burnt rubber. Carl poured the first batch of pancake batter onto the griddle and immediately burned them because he had the heat too high. The smoke alarm started going off and Thomas had to wave a towel under it while Carl scraped black pancakes into the trash. I checked my watch and told them they had 45 minutes until breakfast was supposed to be served. By 7:45, they'd managed to produce a pile of burnt pancakes, runny eggs, and coffee that tasted like motor oil. Thomas carried the plates out to the dining room where everyone was waiting and I followed behind him. Dorothy took one look at the food and wrinkled her nose. Janet cut into her pancake and it was raw in the middle. Frank's wife pushed her eggs around and asked if maybe they could start over. I stood up and said yes, actually, they could start over, because Mom never got to serve burnt food at their reunion without being criticized for it. I told Thomas and Carl to go back to the kitchen and make it again, properly this time. Dorothy whispered to Janet that this was ridiculous, but I heard her and said loudly that it wasn't any more ridiculous than making Mom cook for 70 people alone while everyone else relaxed. Carl looked like he wanted to argue, but Thomas just turned around and headed back to the kitchen. Everyone else sat at the table in uncomfortable silence, their stomachs growling, while the two of them tried again. The second attempt took another hour and came out better, but still not great. By the time people finally got to eat, it was almost 9:30 and everyone was starving and cranky. As soon as the last person finished, I stood up and handed aprons to Janet and Dorothy. I told them they were on cleanup duty and also needed to start prepping ingredients for lunch. Janet's face went bright red and she said she had a very important conference call at 10. I looked at her and said Mom had important things too, like doctor appointments she missed and friends she couldn't see because she was too busy serving everyone. Dorothy started to say something, but I cut her off and pointed at the kitchen. The two of them took the aprons and walked toward the mess their brothers had made, and I could hear them muttering to each other about how unfair this was. I sat back down at the table and poured myself more coffee, this time from the pot Alex had made that actually tasted good. Throughout the morning, I kept everyone busy with different tasks. I sent Frank out to clean the pool, even though we had a pool guy coming later. I had Thomas vacuum the whole downstairs, even though the house was already clean. I made Carl organize the garage, which didn't need organizing. Every time someone sat down to rest, I found something else for them to do. And occasionally, just to drive the point home, I snapped my fingers and asked someone to bring me a drink refill or extra napkins. Frank noticed what I was doing. I could tell by the way he looked at me when I snapped my fingers at Carl to bring me a glass of water. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat but didn't say anything. Dorothy's husband asked if he could help with anything, and I gave him a list of outdoor tasks that kept him busy for hours. By lunchtime, everyone looked exhausted and annoyed, and we were only halfway through day 1. At 11:30, I went into the kitchen where Janet and Dorothy were supposed to be prepping lunch. Instead, I found Dorothy on her phone ordering pizza. I walked over and canceled the order right in front of her, taking her phone and hanging up on the pizza place. She stared at me with her mouth open and said she didn't know how to make pasta and salad for 20 people. I smiled and suggested she figure it out, the same way Mom had to figure out how to cook for 70 people with no notice at their reunion. Janet said this was getting out of hand, that I was being unreasonable. I asked her if it was reasonable to hand Mom her laundry and expect her to wash it while she was already cooking and cleaning for everyone. Janet went quiet and looked away. I pointed at the pantry and told them everything they needed was in there and lunch needed to be ready by 1. Then I walked out and left them to figure it out, just like everyone had left Mom to figure it out. Around 2 in the afternoon, Mom found me in the study where I was checking emails. She closed the door behind her and stood there for a minute before speaking. Her hands twisted together the way they did when she was nervous about something. She asked if maybe I was being too hard on everyone, if all this was really necessary. Her voice came out soft and worried, the same tone she'd used my whole life when trying to keep peace in the family. I got up and hugged her tight, feeling how small she seemed in my arms, even though she was only a few inches shorter than me. I told her they'd been hard on her for years, decades even, and sometimes people needed to walk in someone else's shoes to really understand what they'd done. She hugged me back, but I could feel the tension in her shoulders, the worry that I was causing too much family drama. I reminded her about the finger snapping, the laundry, the 4 days of nonstop work while everyone else relaxed. She nodded against my shoulder but didn't say anything else. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet, but she smiled and said she trusted me. I watched her walk back outside to where everyone was sitting by the pool, and I felt that anger flare up again at how easily she fell back into worrying about their comfort over her own dignity. At 3 o'clock, I called everyone to the tennis courts for the tournament I'd scheduled. I'd paired them strategically, siblings against siblings, so they couldn't coast on anyone else's skills. Thomas and Frank got matched up against Carl and Dorothy's husband, while Janet played with her husband against Dorothy and one of the teenage cousins. I stood at the net with my clipboard and announced that the losing teams would have dinner duty, which meant 3 hours in the kitchen cooking for everyone. Thomas laughed nervously and said he hadn't played tennis in years, and Frank complained that his knee wasn't great. I told them Mom's knees weren't great either, but she'd spent 4 days on her feet at their reunion anyway. The game started, and I sat in the shade with Mom and Alex, watching my uncles and aunts run around the court getting increasingly sweaty and frustrated. Frank kept missing easy shots, and Thomas moved like his body had forgotten how sports worked. By the end of the first match, Frank and Thomas had lost badly, and Carl was grinning like he'd won the lottery. I walked over to the losers and handed them both aprons, telling them dinner needed to be ready by 7, and I expected actual effort this time. Thomas looked at Frank with this exhausted expression, and Frank just shook his head and headed toward the house. I called after them that the menu was posted in the kitchen, and all the ingredients were in the pantry and fridge. Dorothy asked if she could help them since her husband had won, but I said no. The losers had to handle it alone, just like Mom had handled everything alone. Around 5:30, I went into the kitchen to check on their progress. Frank was standing at the stove stirring something in a big pot, his face red and sweaty. Thomas was chopping vegetables at the counter, moving slowly like every cut took major effort. I heard Frank say to Thomas that this was exhausting, that he didn't understand how anyone did this every day. Thomas admitted his feet were killing him, that he'd been standing for over 2 hours and his back was starting to hurt too. They didn't notice me in the doorway at first, so I just stood there listening to them complain. Frank said something about how he'd always thought cooking was relaxing, like those cooking shows made it seem, but this was just painful work. Thomas agreed and said next time he'd try harder to win the tennis match. I walked in then, clapping my hands together cheerfully, and told them Mom had done this for 4 straight days at age 62, while they all sat by the pool drinking and chatting. I reminded them she'd also been up at 5 in the morning and hadn't finished until after 9 at night. Frank looked at me with something like understanding starting to show in his eyes, but he didn't say anything. Thomas just nodded and went back to chopping, moving a bit faster now like he wanted to prove he could handle it. I checked what they were making, gave them a few tips so the food wouldn't be terrible, and left them to finish. Walking back outside, I felt satisfied that they were finally getting a tiny taste of what they'd put Mom through. Dorothy's husband caught me by the pool house around 6. He pulled me aside where nobody else could hear and said this whole weekend felt like punishment, that everyone was walking on eggshells and exhausted. I looked him straight in the eye and told him it wasn't punishment. It was education. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, uncomfortable with my directness. Then he admitted something that made my blood pressure spike. He said Dorothy had come home from the last reunion bragging about how nice it was to be waited on, how it felt like staying at a resort with personal staff. She'd told him that Lucy was so good at taking care of everyone that it was basically her purpose in the family. I felt my hands curl into fists and had to consciously relax them. I asked him if he'd said anything to her about how wrong that was, and he looked away, ashamed. He said he'd thought it was just family dynamics, that maybe Lucy really didn't mind. I told him that nobody actually enjoys being treated like a servant by their own siblings, that his wife had been cruel and everyone had gone along with it. He nodded slowly and said he was starting to see that now, that watching his wife struggle in the kitchen this morning had given him perspective. I told him good, because that was exactly the point of this weekend. He asked if I was planning to ease up at all, and I said not until I was sure the lesson had really sunk in. He walked away looking troubled, and I hoped that meant he'd actually talk to Dorothy about her behavior, instead of just letting it slide. That evening, we all gathered in the dining room for the meal Frank and Thomas had managed to finish. The food was decent, better than their breakfast attempt, and everyone ate quietly. After we'd been eating for a while, Carl cleared his throat and started talking about childhood memories. He brought up the time they'd all gone camping and Dad had caught that huge fish, and how Mom had figured out how to cook it over the campfire. Janet jumped in with a story about Mom teaching her to ride a bike, and Dorothy added something about Mom making Halloween costumes every year. I let them talk for a bit, watching Mom's face light up at the happy memories. She loved these stories, loved remembering when her siblings had actually appreciated her. But then I interrupted, asking if anyone remembered the last few months of Grandpa's life. The table went quiet, and people looked down at their plates. I said Mom had missed her own father's final months being peaceful, because she was too busy doing all the physical care alone. I reminded them that Grandpa had needed help getting to the bathroom, needed his meals prepared special, needed medication on schedule, needed someone to sit with him so he wouldn't be scared. Mom had done all of it by herself while working full-time at the grocery store. Carl tried to say they'd all offered to help, but his voice was weak. Janet nodded along with him, but she wouldn't look at me. I asked them to be specific about when they'd offered and what kind of help they'd given. Nobody answered. I pulled out my phone and started reading texts from that time period. I'd kept them all, screenshots of every conversation where Mom had asked for help. I read Janet's text saying she had a huge listing that week and couldn't possibly take time off. I read Carl's response about a business trip he couldn't reschedule. I read Thomas's message about his daughter's dance recital being the same weekend Mom needed someone to stay with Grandpa. I read Frank's excuse about parent-teacher conferences at his school. I read Dorothy's text saying her husband needed her at some car dealership event. The room went completely silent as I scrolled through message after message, excuse after excuse. Mom sat frozen in her chair, and I saw her face change as she realized I'd kept all these receipts of their broken promises. When I finished reading, nobody spoke for a long minute. Then Janet said quietly that she'd forgotten she'd said all that seeing it written out made it look worse than she'd remembered. I told her it was exactly as bad as it looked, that Mom had begged for help, and they'd all chosen their careers and social lives over their dying father and exhausted sister. Thomas put his head in his hands, and Dorothy wiped tears off her face but didn't say anything. Carl stared at his plate like he wanted to disappear. Frank's wife looked at her husband with this expression of horror, probably realizing for the first time what kind of family she'd married into. The rest of dinner passed in uncomfortable silence, with people barely eating and nobody making eye contact. The next morning, I knocked on the guest room doors at 6 and announced that Frank's wife and Janet's husband were on breakfast duty. I heard confused protests through the doors, and Frank's wife opened hers looking panicked. She said this wasn't fair, that she hadn't done anything wrong, that she was just a spouse. I reminded her loudly that she'd handed Mom her laundry at the last reunion, that she'd asked Mom to watch her teenage kids while the adults talked, that she'd benefited from Mom's service just like everyone else. She started crying and said she didn't know how to cook for this many people, that she'd never done anything like this before. I asked her if it was fair when she treated Mom like hired help, if she'd thought about whether Mom knew how to cook for 70 people with no notice. Janet's husband came out of his room looking angry and asked what was going on. I handed him an apron and told him the kitchen was downstairs and breakfast needed to be ready by 8. He said he had work calls scheduled, and I told him to reschedule them the same way Mom had to reschedule her whole life at their reunion. Frank's wife was still crying in her doorway, and I felt a tiny bit bad but pushed it down. She'd been part of the problem, and the spouses needed to understand their role in enabling this family dynamic. I walked away and left them to figure it out, just like everyone had left Mom to figure everything out. Before lunch, Alex found me in the bedroom and closed the door. He sat on the bed and said gently that I'd made my point, that maybe it was time to ease up on everyone. He said they were clearly getting the message, that pushing harder might just make them defensive instead of reflective. I sat next to him and told him I knew he was right, that the logical part of my brain agreed with him completely. But I said I needed them to really feel it, to understand in their bodies and not just their heads what they'd put Mom through. I needed them to be so exhausted and frustrated and overwhelmed that they'd never forget it, that they'd never be able to snap their fingers at a family member again without remembering this weekend. Alex put his arm around me and said he understood the impulse but warned me about pushing too far. He said there was a line between teaching a lesson and just being cruel, and I needed to be careful not to cross it. I leaned against him and admitted I wasn't sure where that line was anymore, that my anger at them had been building for so long that it was hard to know when enough was enough. He kissed my forehead and said he trusted my judgment, but wanted me to think about what the end goal was here. Did I want them to genuinely change, or did I just want them to suffer? I told him I wanted both, and he laughed sadly, and said that was fair, but I should probably focus more on the change part. We sat there for a few minutes before I got up to go check on lunch prep. During lunch, Rose had organized the teenage cousins to help serve the food. I watched as several of Frank's kids and Carl's daughter brought out dishes and refilled drinks without being asked. They actually seemed to enjoy helping, chatting with each other and joking around while they worked. One of Frank's sons asked his dad why Grandma had to do everything alone at the last reunion if helping was this easy. Frank looked like he'd been slapped and he stammered something about adults handling things. His son looked confused and said, "But we're helping now and it's not hard, so why couldn't everyone help Grandma?" The question hung in the air and nobody had a good answer. Janet's teenage daughter said her mom had always told her that helping with family events was important, so why didn't the adults help at the last reunion? Dorothy tried to change the subject, but her niece pressed the point, saying it seemed mean to make one person do everything. The kids kept asking questions that the adults couldn't answer without admitting they'd been selfish and cruel. I caught Rose's eye across the table and she gave me a small smile. She'd done this on purpose, getting the kids involved to show how easy it was to help and to make the adults face questions from their own children. It was brilliant, and I made a mental note to thank her later. The cousins finished serving and sat down to eat with everyone else, still chattering happily about how fun it was to help out. Their parents sat in uncomfortable silence. That afternoon, I gathered everyone in the living room and told them I had something to show them. I'd set up the big screen TV and had my laptop connected to it. People filed in looking curious and tired, settling onto couches and chairs. Mom sat in the front with Dad, looking nervous about what I was about to do. I hit play on the video compilation I'd made and the screen filled with footage from the last reunion. I'd taken tons of video that weekend, pretending I was just documenting family memories, but really I was collecting evidence. The first clip showed Thomas snapping his fingers at Mom to get him a drink. The second showed Carl complaining about the meat being dry. The third showed Frank's wife handing Mom laundry. I'd edited together every dismissive comment, every time someone treated Mom like staff, every moment where she was ignored or taken for granted. The footage showed Mom's face going from happy and excited at the beginning to exhausted and dead-eyed by day 3. It showed her trying to eat dinner and being interrupted 5 times in 2 minutes by people demanding things. It showed Dorothy laughing while saying some people were meant to be servers. It showed Janet rolling her eyes when Dad tried to help Mom. The room was dead silent as they watched themselves on screen. I saw Dorothy put her hand over her mouth, saw Thomas close his eyes like he couldn't watch anymore. Janet was crying quietly, and Carl had gone pale. When the video ended after 12 minutes, nobody moved or spoke for a long time. Dorothy's hands shook as she covered her face, and I watched her shoulders start moving up and down with sobs. Janet sat frozen next to her on the couch, staring at the blank TV screen where the video had just played. Thomas had his head in his hands like he was trying to hide from what he'd just seen, and Carl kept his eyes on the floor like looking up would force him to face what he'd done. Frank's wife had left the room halfway through the video, and I could hear her crying in the hallway. Dorothy pulled her hands away from her face and looked at Mom with red, wet eyes. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out at first, just this choking sound. Finally, she managed to say she didn't realize it looked like that from the outside, that watching herself laugh while saying those things about servers made her sick. Janet wiped at her own tears and admitted she was horrified watching herself hand Mom the laundry like Mom was hired help. She said seeing it on screen made her understand how cruel and dismissive they'd all been, how they'd treated their own sister like she didn't matter as a person. Thomas lifted his head just enough to look at Mom, and his face was all twisted up with shame. He said watching himself snap his fingers at her was one of the worst things he'd ever seen himself do, and he couldn't believe he'd done it so casually, like it was nothing. Carl finally looked up from the floor and tried to meet Mom's eyes but couldn't hold her gaze. He said he had no excuse for complaining about the food she'd spent hours making, for treating her efforts like they were worthless. Mom stood up suddenly, and for a second nobody moved. Then she walked out of the room without saying anything, and I heard the back door open and close. I waited a few seconds to give her space, then followed her out. I found her in the guest house, sitting on the bed with her hands pressed against her face, crying. But these tears were different from the ones in the car after the last reunion. Those had been silent, defeated tears that she'd tried to hide. These were loud, messy sobs that shook her whole body. I sat down next to her and put my arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into me. After a minute, she pulled her hands away and looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before. She said she was overwhelmed because for 30 years, she'd been the one fighting for everyone else, making sure everyone else was okay, putting everyone else first. Nobody had ever fought for her like this. Nobody had ever shown her siblings how wrong they were. Nobody had ever made them see what they'd done to her. She said she'd convinced herself that it didn't matter, that family was more important than her feelings, that keeping everyone together meant accepting how they treated her. But watching me stand up for her, watching me force them to see what they'd done, made her realize that maybe her feelings did matter. I asked if she wanted me to stop, if this was too much conflict for her to handle. I told her we could end the weekend early, send everyone home, forget the whole thing. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and shook her head hard. She said no, that she'd spent 30 years avoiding conflict to keep the family together, always smoothing things over, always making excuses for them, always pretending their treatment didn't hurt. And maybe it was time someone showed them that her feelings matter too. She said she was tired of being the one who always gave in, who always sacrificed, who always made herself smaller, so everyone else could feel bigger. She looked at me and said she wanted to go back in there, wanted to hear what they had to say, wanted to see if any of this would actually change anything. I hugged her tight and told her I was proud of her, that it took real strength to face this instead of running from it. We sat there for another minute and then she stood up and straightened her shirt. She took a deep breath and headed back toward the main house, and I followed behind her. When we walked back into the living room, Dad was standing in front of Mom's siblings talking in this low, firm voice I'd only heard him use a handful of times in my life. He was telling them that he'd watched them disrespect his wife for decades, and stayed quiet for her sake because she'd asked him to. He said Lucy had given up her education to take care of their father while they were all off building their fancy careers. She'd worked double shifts at the grocery store and came home to change bedpans and give medications, and sit up all night when their father couldn't sleep. He said they'd all promised to help, to take turns, to share the burden, but every time Lucy called them, they had excuses. Too busy with work, too busy with their kids, too busy with their lives. So Lucy did it alone for 3 years while their father slowly died, and by the time he passed, she was 21 years old with no college degree, no savings, and no time left to catch up with her siblings. Dad's voice got even quieter as he said they'd built their success on the back of Lucy's sacrifice, and then they'd spent the next 30 years looking down on her for not having what they had. Frank suddenly broke down, his face crumpling as he started crying. He said he'd always felt guilty about leaving Mom with all the caregiving, but it was easier to pretend she didn't mind than to face his own selfishness. He admitted that every time she'd called asking for help, he'd told himself she was better at it anyway, that she was naturally more patient and caring. But the truth was, he just didn't want to deal with the hard stuff, didn't want to sacrifice his comfortable life. His honesty seemed to crack something open in the room because Janet started nodding and crying too. She said she'd done the same thing, convinced herself that Mom was happy to help because that's what she was good at. But watching the video made her realize she'd just been lying to herself to avoid feeling guilty. Thomas looked at Mom and said he knew what they were doing at the reunion was wrong while it was happening. He said every time someone snapped their fingers or made a demand, he felt uncomfortable but didn't say anything because everyone else was doing it. He admitted he chose his own comfort over defending his sister, and he was ashamed that he'd gone along with treating her like staff instead of family. Carl added that they'd always treated Mom's work as less valuable because she didn't have a college degree. He said they'd convinced themselves that managing a grocery store wasn't as important as being a dentist or running a real estate office, which he now saw was cruel and wrong. He said Mom's work had been just as hard as theirs, maybe harder because she'd had to do it while raising kids and managing a household without the money or status they all had. Dorothy turned to face Mom directly, and fresh tears started running down her face. She said the comment about servers and being served was unforgivable, that she'd been showing off for her husband and trying to feel superior. She admitted that she'd always been jealous of how easily Mom connected with people, how everyone at the grocery store loved her, how she'd built this full life without needing the status symbols Dorothy had always chased. She said Mom's life of service actually took more strength and sacrifice than any of their corporate careers, because Mom had chosen to give instead of always taking. Dorothy said she'd spent her whole life trying to prove she was better than everyone else, and she'd used Mom as someone to look down on so she could feel successful. But watching herself on that video made her see that she was actually the small one, the mean one, the one who should be ashamed. I waited until Dorothy finished, and then I told them that I didn't bring them here just to make them feel bad or to get revenge. I said Mom would never demand respect for herself because that's not who she is. She'd spent her whole life putting everyone else first, making sure everyone else was happy and comfortable. So someone had to demand respect for her. Someone had to show them what they'd been doing. I explained that I wanted them to understand what they'd taken for granted all these years, and to start treating Mom as an equal family member, not as free labor or as someone less important than them. I said the work they'd done this weekend was nothing compared to what Mom had done for them her entire life, and if they couldn't handle 2 days of cooking and cleaning, they had no right to ever treat her like a servant again. Janet looked at Mom and asked if she could forgive them. The room went quiet, waiting for Mom's answer. Mom took a deep breath and said, forgiveness wasn't really the issue because she'd always forgiven them. Every time they'd dismissed her or looked down on her or treated her like help, she'd forgiven them because she loved them and wanted to keep the family together. But she said forgiveness doesn't mean accepting bad treatment. It doesn't mean pretending things are okay when they're not. She told them she wanted a real relationship with her siblings, not one where she had to earn their love through service. She said she wanted them to call her and ask about her life, not just call when they needed something. She wanted them to respect her work and her choices, even if they were different from theirs. She wanted to be included as an equal, not as the helper who stayed in the background while they lived their important lives. The next morning, I didn't assign any tasks. I woke up early with Alex and we put out breakfast stuff on the big kitchen island. Coffee, juice, fruit, pastries from the bakery, yogurt, and granola. We set out plates and mugs and silverware and just let everything sit there. Around 8, people started wandering into the kitchen looking confused. Thomas came in first and stopped when he saw the food laid out. He asked if we needed help setting up and I told him it was already done. Dorothy and Janet came in next and they both looked around like they were waiting for me to hand them aprons or task lists. Carl asked what time breakfast service started and I said there was no service, just food for people to help themselves. Frank's wife asked what she should be doing, and I said whatever she wanted. I explained that today was about choosing to help, not being forced to. I said yesterday was about understanding what Mom went through, but today was about showing who they wanted to be going forward. I watched Thomas push back from the table first and start stacking plates without anyone saying a word. Frank joined him at the sink, loading dishes into the dishwasher while Thomas scraped leftover food into the trash. Dorothy got up and walked over to where Mom sat, pulling out the chair beside her and pouring fresh coffee into Mom's cup. She set the pot down gently and touched Mom's shoulder, just for a second, before sitting down next to her. Janet brought over cream and sugar without being asked. These were small things, tiny gestures that most families probably did without thinking, but for us they felt huge. I glanced at Alex and he gave me this little nod, like he saw it too. Carl finished his breakfast and carried his plate to the sink instead of leaving it on the table. He rinsed it off and handed it to Frank, who was still loading the dishwasher. Then Carl walked back over to where I was standing by the kitchen island and asked if we could talk privately for a minute. We went out to the back patio where nobody else was around. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other and not quite making eye contact. He said he'd been thinking about everything that happened this weekend, and about Mom's whole life, really. He said he wanted to talk to the family about setting up some kind of financial support system for Mom and Dad. He explained that he and the others had way more money than they needed, and Mom had given up years of earning potential when she took care of their dad. Those were years she could have been building her career, saving for retirement, doing something for herself. Instead, she'd sacrificed all of that for their father, while the rest of them built their fancy lives. I didn't know what to say at first because I hadn't expected this. Carl had always been the most distant of Mom's siblings, the one who barely showed up for family stuff unless it was convenient. But here he was, actually acknowledging what Mom had lost. I told him I appreciated the offer, but that was really between him and Mom. I said she needed to be part of that conversation, not have it decided for her. He nodded and said he understood, that he'd bring it up with her directly. We walked back inside and I felt this weird mix of hope and doubt, wondering if he'd actually follow through or if this was just guilt talking. Later that afternoon, Rose suggested we all take a walk around the property since the weather was nice. Most people joined in, spreading out along the path that wound through the trees behind the house. Rose fell back to walk beside me while everyone else stayed ahead of us. She said she was proud of what I'd done this weekend, that someone needed to stand up for Mom. But then her voice got quieter, and she admitted she was worried about whether any of this would actually stick once everyone went home. She said forcing people to see their behavior was one thing, but making them change permanently was something else entirely. I looked at the group ahead of us, watching Thomas and Frank walking together, Dorothy linking her arm through Mom's, and I felt the same worry Rose was voicing. I told her I had the exact same concern, that awareness didn't always translate into lasting change. People could feel bad in the moment, apologize, even mean it genuinely, but then go right back to their old patterns once they were back in their regular lives. Rose said she hoped this time was different, that maybe the shock of seeing themselves on video and experiencing what Mom went through would be enough to create real change. I wanted to believe that too, but I'd seen too many people make promises they didn't keep. We caught up with the rest of the group near the tennis courts, and I pushed the doubt down, trying to focus on what was happening right now instead of worrying about the future. When we got back to the house, Frank gathered everyone in the living room and said he had an idea he wanted to run by the family. He suggested they set up a rotating schedule for future reunions, where everyone took turns hosting and everyone contributed equally to the work. No more putting everything on one person. No more assumptions about who should cook or clean or serve. Janet jumped in and added that they should also hire actual help for these events, so nobody got stuck doing everything, even if they were hosting. She said they all had the money to split the cost of caterers and cleaning services, so there was no excuse for making family members work like staff. Dorothy nodded in agreement and said that sounded fair. Carl said he'd help coordinate it and make sure everyone paid their share up front so the host didn't have to cover costs. I sat back and listened to them planning this out, working through details about how often they'd meet and who would host next. It felt surreal watching them actually try to fix the system that had hurt Mom for so long. Part of me wanted to jump in and help organize it, but I made myself stay quiet and let them figure it out. This needed to be their initiative, their commitment, not something I pushed them into. Dorothy stood up suddenly and said she had something else to propose. She said they should create a family fund to reimburse Mom for all the money she'd spent taking care of their father. She talked about medical supplies, medications, lost wages from cutting her hours at work, all the expenses that had piled up during those 3 years. She said Mom had never asked them for help, and they'd never offered, and that was wrong. Thomas immediately agreed and said they should also cover some of the home repairs Mom and Dad had been putting off because of money. He mentioned the roof that needed replacing and the water heater that was on its last legs. Frank said he'd contribute to both the reimbursement and the repairs. Carl pulled out his phone and started making notes about costs and what everyone could afford to chip in. Janet suggested they make it a regular thing, not just a one-time payment, something ongoing so Mom and Dad didn't have to worry about money as they got older. I watched all of this happening and felt something shift inside me. The anger I'd been carrying around for months, the fury that had driven me to plan this whole revenge weekend, started to ease up. It didn't disappear completely because I knew words were easy and actions were what mattered. But seeing them actually put real solutions on the table instead of just apologizing, made me feel like maybe this weekend had accomplished something. Mom was sitting in the armchair by the window and she caught my eye across the room. She smiled at me, this soft, genuine smile that made her whole face light up, and she looked lighter than I'd seen her in years. Not just physically lighter, though she did seem to be sitting up straighter, but lighter in her spirit, like something heavy had been lifted off her shoulders. That final evening, we all worked together to make dinner. Not because I assigned tasks or made anyone do anything, but because people just naturally pitched in. Thomas and Carl handled the grill outside, cooking steaks and chicken. Dorothy and Janet made salads and side dishes in the kitchen. Frank set the table while his wife helped Mom put together a dessert. Rose and I coordinated everything, making sure we had enough food, and that everything would be ready at the same time. Alex opened wine and poured drinks for everyone. The whole process felt easy and fun, people laughing and talking while they worked, asking each other for help when they needed it. Nobody complained about being tired or tried to get out of helping. The conversation during dinner flowed naturally, with people actually asking Mom about her life instead of just talking about themselves. Thomas asked about her work at the grocery store, not in a condescending way, but with real interest in what she did all day. Dorothy wanted to know about Mom's garden and what she was growing this year. Frank asked about her book club and what they were reading. These were basic questions, things siblings should know about each other, but for Mom's family, they were revolutionary. Mom talked more during this one meal than she had during entire reunions in the past, and I could see her relaxing into the attention, enjoying being seen as a person with her own interests and life. After we finished eating and cleared the dishes together, Thomas stood up and asked if he could say something. The room got quiet and everyone turned to look at him. He said he wanted to apologize to Mom, really apologize, not just say sorry but acknowledge specific things he'd done wrong. He brought up the last reunion at Dorothy's place, how he'd snapped his fingers at Mom to get her attention like she was a waitress. He said that was disrespectful and cruel and he was ashamed of himself for doing it. He talked about other times over the years when he'd dismissed her work or made comments about her life choices, always acting like his career as a dentist made him more important than her. He said he'd been a terrible brother and he wanted to do better going forward. When he finished, Janet stood up and made her own apology. She talked about the laundry incident and about all the times she'd treated Mom like help instead of family. She admitted she'd been jealous of how easily Mom connected with people and how she'd used that jealousy to justify putting Mom down. Carl apologized for being absent and distant, for treating family obligations like inconveniences he had to tolerate. Dorothy cried while she apologized, bringing up the server's comment and how she'd spent years trying to prove she was better than Mom. Frank apologized for letting his wife treat Mom badly, and for never standing up for her when the others were being cruel. Each apology was different, some more articulate than others, but they all felt genuine. Nobody was making excuses or trying to minimize what they'd done. Mom sat quietly through all of it, listening to each sibling with this calm expression on her face. When they finished, she took a deep breath and said she appreciated the apologies. But then she said what mattered more than apologies was how they treated her going forward. She told them she wanted to be included as an equal, not as someone who existed to serve them or make their lives easier. She wanted them to call her and ask about her life, to respect her work and her choices even if they were different from theirs. She said she'd spent too many years accepting bad treatment because she loved them and wanted to keep the family together, but she was done with that. Forgiveness didn't mean accepting mistreatment. It didn't mean pretending things were okay when they weren't. Several of her siblings were crying now, including Thomas, who was usually so controlled. Dorothy got up and hugged Mom, holding on tight and whispering something I couldn't hear. Janet and Carl joined the hug, and then Frank, until all of Mom's siblings were gathered around her in this group embrace that felt both awkward and genuine at the same time. Frank's wife came over to me while everyone else was still hugging and crying. She said she wanted to apologize for calling this a social experiment earlier in the weekend. She said she understood now that it wasn't an experiment. It was necessary intervention. She admitted that watching everything unfold had made her think about her own family and how she treated Frank's mother. She said she'd been doing some of the same things to her mother-in-law that Frank's siblings had done to Mom, treating her like she was less important because she didn't have a career or money. She thanked me for making her see that pattern before it was too late to change it. I didn't know what to say to that because I hadn't planned for the weekend to affect anyone beyond Mom's immediate siblings. But I told her I was glad she'd gotten something out of it, and I hoped she'd follow through on treating her mother-in-law better. She promised she would, and then went back to join her family. The next morning, suitcases appeared in the hallway and people started loading cars. Thomas came over to Mom with his bags and set them down to give her a long hug. He held on tight and told her he was going to call her next week, and he meant it this time. Janet was writing down Mom's phone number in her actual planner, not just typing it into her phone where she'd forget about it. Carl kept checking with Mom about when would be a good time to visit her at home, and he wanted to see the grocery store where she worked because he'd never actually been there in all these years. Dorothy pulled Mom aside and asked if they could have lunch sometime soon. Just the two of them. No husbands or kids or other siblings. Frank's wife came over to apologize one more time and told Mom she was an amazing woman. The cousins were hugging each other and making plans to stay in touch through social media, instead of only seeing each other every 5 years. One of Frank's sons told Mom he thought she was really cool, and asked if he could come visit sometime. The energy was completely different from when everyone arrived 3 days ago, expecting to treat Mom like hired help. Carl walked over to Mom while she was saying goodbye to some of the cousins, and pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. He handed it to her and told her to open it later, but Mom opened it right there. Inside was a check for $5,000. Mom's face went pale and she tried to hand it back, but Carl closed her hands around the envelope. He explained that he'd talked to the other siblings, and they all agreed to contribute quarterly to a family support fund for her and Dad. This check was just the first installment, partial back payment for the 3 years she spent taking care of their father while they built their careers. Mom started crying and saying she couldn't accept it, that family doesn't pay each other for caregiving. Carl's voice got firm, and he told her it wasn't charity, it was acknowledging a debt they owed. Thomas came over and backed him up, saying they'd taken advantage of her kindness for too long and this was the least they could do. Janet added that Mom had given up college and career opportunities to nurse their dad, and that sacrifice had real financial costs they should have recognized years ago. Mom kept shaking her head and trying to refuse, but Dorothy joined in and told her to please accept it, because it would help them feel less guilty about everything. Frank said they wanted to do this, needed to do this, and Mom finally nodded and put the envelope in her purse. Cars started pulling out of the driveway one by one. Thomas waved from his window and called out that he'd see Mom soon. Carl honked and gave a thumbs up. Janet blew kisses. But Dorothy's car stayed parked even after everyone else left. She got out and walked back to where Mom was standing with Dad, Rose, Alex, and me. Dorothy's eyes were red and she looked like she'd been crying in the car. She asked if she could talk to Mom alone for a minute, and Mom nodded. They walked over to the garden area while the rest of us hung back by the house. I couldn't hear what Dorothy was saying, but I could see her gesturing and wiping her eyes. Then she pulled Mom into a hug and held on for a really long time. Mom's arms went around Dorothy and they just stood there holding each other. Dorothy's shoulders were shaking and I realized she was sobbing. Mom was rubbing her back and saying something I couldn't hear. They stayed like that for at least 5 minutes before Dorothy finally pulled back and wiped her face. She said something else to Mom and Mom nodded and smiled. Dorothy touched Mom's cheek and then walked back to her car. She waved at all of us before getting in and driving away. Mom stood in the garden for another minute before coming back to join us. We all went to sit by the pool in the quiet after everyone left. The house felt empty after having 20 people in it for 3 days. Mom sat down in one of the lounge chairs and stared at the water. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Mom started talking about how she never imagined her siblings would actually change. She'd spent so many years accepting that things would always be the way they were, that she'd always be the one who served and they'd always be the ones who took. She said she'd made peace with it because family was important and she didn't want to lose them, but now everything felt different and she didn't know how to process it. She was overwhelmed by the possibility of having real relationships with them, of being treated as an equal instead of as help. Her voice cracked when she talked about Dorothy apologizing, about Thomas planning to call her, about Carl organizing the support fund. She said she felt like she'd spent 30 years bracing herself for hurt, and now she didn't know how to accept kindness from them. Dad reached over and took Mom's hand. He told me he was proud of how I stood up for her, that he'd regretted staying quiet all these years, but didn't know how to challenge the family dynamic without making things worse. He said he'd watched them disrespect his wife over and over, and it killed him every time, but Mom always asked him to let it go to keep the peace. He admitted he should have been braver, should have defended her more, should have told her siblings what he really thought of their behavior. I squeezed his shoulder and told him that his quiet support of Mom all these years mattered more than he knew. Mom had always talked about how Dad stood by her through everything, how he never made her feel less than because she didn't have a degree or fancy career. I said that steady love and respect at home gave her the strength to tolerate her siblings' treatment, and that was worth more than any confrontation would have been. Rose pulled out an actual notebook from her bag, and we all stared at her. She laughed and said she'd been taking notes all weekend because she wanted to be the kind of person who stands up for people she loves, not just goes along with family patterns. She flipped through pages of observations about how I'd structured the weekend, what I'd said to each sibling, how I'd mirrored their behavior back at them. She'd written down Mom's boundary-setting speech and Dorothy's apology word for word. She said watching me advocate for Mom showed her what real loyalty looked like, and she wanted to learn from it. We all laughed about her literally having a notebook, but I was touched that she saw this weekend as a model for her own life. Rose said she'd spent too many years being the baby of our family, going along with whatever everyone else decided, and she was ready to have her own voice. Mom reached over and hugged her, telling her she was proud of both her daughters. Over the next few weeks, Mom's phone started ringing more than it had in years. Thomas called to ask about her day and actually listened to her answers. Janet texted pictures of her lunch and asked what Mom was eating. Carl sent updates about his work and asked questions about the grocery store. Dorothy called just to chat about nothing in particular. The conversations were different from before because Mom's siblings were asking about her life, instead of just talking about themselves. Janet admitted her real estate business was struggling because the market had shifted, and she didn't know if she could keep her office open. She asked Mom for advice about dealing with financial stress, and Mom talked her through some of the strategies she'd used when money was tight. Carl called one night and told Mom he was getting divorced, that his wife had left him 6 months ago and he'd been too embarrassed to tell anyone. He said he'd been going to work and coming home to an empty house and pretending everything was fine. Mom listened and offered support without judgment. Thomas texted about his daughter having trouble in the school and asked if Mom remembered how she'd helped me through similar issues. The siblings were showing vulnerability they'd never displayed before, treating Mom like someone whose opinion and experience mattered. Thomas called one Saturday and invited Mom and Dad to visit him for a long weekend. He promised it would be a real vacation where they'd be guests, not help. He said he wanted to show them around his city and take them to nice restaurants and treat them the way he should have been treating them all along. Mom was nervous about accepting because part of her worried it was too good to be true. She told me she was scared they'd get there and Thomas would have a list of chores or projects he needed help with. Dad convinced her to give Thomas a chance to follow through on his promises. He said people were showing them who they'd become, and they should believe it until proven otherwise. Mom finally agreed and they made plans to visit in 3 weeks. The visit to Thomas's place went better than Mom expected. Thomas and his wife picked them up from the airport and took them straight to a fancy hotel they'd booked for Mom and Dad. Thomas said he wanted them to have privacy and comfort, not feel like they were imposing on his household. They spent the weekend doing tourist activities and eating at nice restaurants. Thomas asked Dad about his mechanic work with actual interest, wanting to know about different cars and repair techniques. They went to a classic car show together, and Thomas spent hours listening to Dad talk about engines and restoration projects. Thomas's wife took Mom shopping and insisted on buying her a new outfit. They treated Mom and Dad like honored guests the entire time, and Mom called me every night to say she couldn't believe how different Thomas was acting. She kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, but it never did. Dorothy started a family group chat that included all the siblings, their spouses, and the adult children. The tone was completely different from any previous family communication. People were sharing photos of ordinary moments instead of just bragging about achievements. Carl posted a picture of his sad desk lunch and everyone responded with sympathy and their own bad lunch stories. Janet shared a photo of a house she couldn't sell with a joke about the terrible wallpaper. Frank posted about his son getting a C on a test and asked for study advice. Mom posted a picture of her garden with the tomatoes just starting to ripen, and the responses were enthusiastic and genuine. Dorothy commented about how beautiful the plants looked. Thomas asked what variety of tomatoes she was growing. Janet wanted tips for starting her own garden. The chat became this space where people celebrated each other's ordinary lives, instead of competing over who had the most impressive accomplishments. Mom checked the chat multiple times a day and smiled every time someone posted something new. A few weeks later, Frank called Mom on a Tuesday evening. I was over at her house helping her organize some old photos when her phone rang. She looked at the screen and seemed surprised to see his name. She answered and listened for a minute, then her whole face changed. She started nodding and smiling, and when she hung up, she looked like someone had given her the best gift. Frank had called to ask for her advice about his son who was having trouble in the school. He told her that watching how Rose and I turned out made him realize Mom had real wisdom about raising kids. He said he'd been too proud to ask for help before, but he needed her guidance now. Mom spent the next hour on the phone with him, talking through strategies she'd used when I struggled with math in middle school. She glowed with pride the entire time, and after the call ended, she kept saying she couldn't believe Frank actually valued her opinion about something important. 3 months passed, and one Saturday morning, Mom called me in a panic. She said cars were pulling up to her house and she hadn't invited anyone over. I drove there fast, worried something was wrong. When I arrived, all 5 siblings were standing in her driveway with painting supplies, tools, and boxes of materials. Dorothy walked up to Mom and said they were there to do the repairs they'd promised to fund. They spent the entire weekend at her house. Thomas and Carl painted the exterior while Frank fixed the deck boards that had been loose for years. Janet and Dorothy worked on updating the kitchen cabinets. Even the spouses helped. Nobody complained about the work or tried to leave early. Mom kept offering to make them lunch, but they insisted on ordering pizza so she could rest. By Sunday evening, the house looked better than it had in a decade. During that repair weekend, Carl pulled me aside while we were both getting drinks from the cooler. He looked uncomfortable, like he wanted to say something but wasn't sure how to start. Finally, he told me that the revenge reunion had been a wake-up call about more than just how he treated Mom. He said he'd been going through his whole life treating people as either useful or disposable. His wife left him because he only paid attention to her when he needed something. His kids barely talked to him because he only cared about their achievements, not who they were as people. He told me he'd started going to therapy to work on his empathy and connection problems. He said watching Mom serve everyone for years while he took it for granted made him realize he'd been doing the same thing in every relationship he had. He thanked me for forcing him to see it, even though it hurt. A month later, Janet showed up at Mom and Dad's house with a man none of us had met before. She introduced him as her boyfriend and said she wanted Mom to meet him first, before she even introduced him to her own kids. She told Mom that her opinion mattered and she wanted her blessing before things got more serious. Mom seemed shocked that Janet was asking for her approval about anything. They sat at the kitchen table for over an hour while Janet's boyfriend answered Mom's questions. Mom gave her honest thoughts about some things she noticed, both good concerns and positive signs. She talked about red flags to watch for and green flags that showed someone was worth trusting. Janet listened carefully and took notes on her phone. Before they left, Janet hugged Mom tight and said she should have been asking for this kind of advice years ago. The family decided to do Christmas at Mom and Dad's house that year. Everyone agreed to bring food and help with decorations instead of expecting Mom to handle everything. The week before Christmas, siblings kept showing up with boxes of ornaments and lights. Thomas brought a tree that barely fit through the front door. Dorothy arrived with enough food to feed an army. The small ranch house got so crowded that people were sitting on the floor and standing in corners, but nobody seemed to mind. The energy felt completely different from past holidays. People were laughing and telling stories and actually enjoying being together. There was no tension about who had the biggest house or the best career. Carl's kids were playing with Frank's teenagers. Janet's boyfriend fit right in and helped Dad set up the outdoor lights. The chaos felt warm instead of stressful. During Christmas dinner, Thomas stood up and tapped his glass to get everyone's attention. The room went quiet, and he started talking about Mom. He thanked her for all the years she spent taking care of their dad while they were off building their careers. He said she taught them what real family love looked like, even though it took them way too long to see it. He admitted that having success in your career means nothing if you fail at basic human decency toward the people who matter most. His voice cracked a little when he said it, and several people were crying by the time he finished. Mom wiped her eyes and told him that was the nicest thing anyone had ever said to her. The rest of dinner felt different after that, like something had shifted in the family for good. After the holidays ended and things calmed down, Mom came over to my house for coffee. She told me she felt like she finally had the sibling relationship she'd always wanted. She said she wasn't just the family servant anymore, but an equal member with her own voice. For years, she'd accepted being treated badly, because she thought that was the price of having family in her life. But standing up for herself, even though I was the one who did it first, helped her learn to stand up for herself directly. She'd started saying no to things she didn't want to do. She'd started asking for help instead of just giving it. Her siblings were actually listening to her now and treating her opinions like they mattered. She looked lighter somehow, like she'd been carrying something heavy for decades and finally put it down. A few weeks later, Dorothy called Mom and invited her to join her book club. Mom seemed nervous about it because she thought Dorothy's friends would all be wealthy women who'd look down on her. But Dorothy picked her up for the first meeting and introduced her to everyone as her sister, who was the strongest person she knew. The women in the group were actually really nice and treated Mom like she belonged there from the start. Mom started going every month and made genuine friends outside of just family obligations. She'd come home from book club meetings excited to tell me about the discussions they had. She started reading more and having opinions about books and joining in conversations with confidence. It was like watching her discover a part of herself that had been buried for years. 6 months after the revenge reunion, we had another family gathering at Dorothy's lake house. I watched everything carefully to see if the changes had actually lasted, or if people would slip back into old patterns. Everyone showed up and immediately started helping unload food and set up tables without being asked. During meals, people took turns serving and nobody snapped their fingers or made demands. When Mom sat down to eat, she actually got to finish her food without someone interrupting to ask for something. People were asking her about her life and her book club and her garden. They listened to her answers with real interest instead of just waiting for their turn to talk about themselves. Thomas asked Dad detailed questions about a car he was working on. Carl showed Mom pictures of his kids and asked for advice about their problems. The whole dynamic had shifted from competition and judgment to actual care about each other's lives. Frank pulled me aside on the last day of that gathering and asked if we could talk privately. We walked down to the dock and sat looking out at the water. He told me he needed to thank me for forcing them all to face their behavior at my house. He admitted he was angry at first, that he thought I was being cruel and unnecessary. But over the past 6 months, he'd come to realize I gave them a gift by not letting them continue being terrible siblings. Their relationship with Mom was now one of the best parts of his life. He actually knew his sister as a person, instead of just someone who showed up to serve at family events. He said he'd been calling her for advice about work problems and life stuff, and her perspective helped him more than he ever expected. He looked at me with tears in his eyes and said he was sorry it took something so drastic to wake them all up, but he was grateful I cared enough about Mom to do it. I waited until the next family gathering at Dorothy's house to make our announcement. Alex and I had kept the secret for 3 months, waiting for the right moment when everyone would be together. We showed up with a gift bag and handed it to Mom during lunch. She pulled out the tiny baby onesie that said Grandma's favorite and just stared at it for a few seconds before the realization hit. Her hands started shaking and tears rolled down her face as she stood up and hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. Dorothy saw the onesie and started crying too. Then Janet jumped up and grabbed Alex in a hug. Thomas came over and shook Alex's hand, then pulled me into a hug and told me congratulations. Carl raised his glass and made a toast to the new baby and to Mom becoming a grandmother. Frank's wife started asking about due dates and whether we knew the gender yet. The whole table erupted in excitement and questions and plans. Janet immediately said she wanted to throw the baby shower at her house, but Dorothy cut in and said her place was bigger and had the better backyard. Thomas laughed and said they were already fighting over who gets to host, which made everyone else laugh too. Carl offered to set up a college fund for the baby, and Frank said he'd help us research the best preschools in our area. Mom sat there with tears still streaming down her face, holding the onesie against her chest like it was the most precious thing in the world. Dorothy reached over and squeezed Mom's hand, telling her she'd be the best grandmother and they'd all help however they could. Janet started making lists on her phone about baby shower themes and dates. Thomas pulled out his calendar to block off time around my due date so he could be available to help. The energy at the table felt completely different from that awful reunion at Dorothy's lake house. People were competing to be helpful and generous instead of competing to show off or look important. I watched Mom laughing with her siblings as they planned how they'd all pitch in with babysitting and argued playfully about whose turn it would be to watch the baby first. She looked happier than I'd seen her in years, fully included in the conversation, and treated like her opinions mattered. The revenge reunion had changed something fundamental in how they related to each other. They weren't perfect, and sometimes old patterns still showed up in small ways, but the core dynamic had shifted from service and dismissal to actual respect. Before everyone left that afternoon, Mom pulled me aside into Dorothy's kitchen. She held both my hands and told me that standing up for her at my house had changed her entire life. She said she finally felt valued by her family, not just tolerated or used. For decades, she'd believed her worth came from what she could do for other people, but now she understood she mattered just as herself. The apologies were nice and the help was appreciated, but the real gift was feeling like a person to them instead of just a pair of hands to cook and clean. She said watching her siblings fight over who gets to host my baby shower instead of who can avoid helping made her realize how far they'd all come. She hugged me and whispered thank you, and I hugged her back, knowing that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone you love is refuse to let them be treated badly, even by family.